Hello everyone, my name is Garvin and I read things that matter about them on the internet for your entertainment. Today we're talking about Aquaman, the DC underwater hero and king. Now, Aquaman actually has a couple of different origins and I'm going to touch on some of them, hopefully most of them here, but the classic mainstream origin that most of you are aware of, I'm actually going to hold that off until next video. Where we tackle Aquaman the movie. Today, I'm mostly going to focus on a miniseries that was turned into a graphic novel called the Atlantean Chronicles. Now, some of you may be asking, why is Aquaman getting 2 videos to Namor's 1? To put this simply, this is an Atlantis video series, and Atlantis and Aquaman are tied together at a more fundamental level than Namor and Atlantis, and I think I made that case in the last video. If you disagree, please feel free to say so in the comments, though. Getting to the video, however, Aquaman first appeared in November of 1941 in More Fun Comics. He was created by Paul Norris and Mort Weisinger. Fun fact, Mort would go on to create other DC characters such as Green Arrow, Johnny Quick, and the First Vigilante. The first version of Aquaman was the son of a famous, but in the comics unnamed, undersea explorer who found the lost city of Atlantis and built himself a home amongst the ruins. Using the relics and the decoded records of Atlantis, he taught our hero Aquaman, who, again, is his son, how to breathe underwater, gain superhuman strength, and speak to undersea life. Although he could only do this for an hour at a time because there is nothing more heroic than a time limit. Aquaman would use these abilities to fight Nazi U-boats, pirates, and other various nautical villains. In the 1950s and 60s, the classical origin was created, so at this point, Atlantis is not a dead civilization that Aquaman has learned from, but a living and thriving civilization that he is a part of, and we'll come back to that in the next video. Instead, we're going to focus on the origin that was created in the 1980s after an event called Crisis on Infinite Earths. Not going to go too deep in the weeds on that one, but basically, the men in charge of DC Comics felt that the fictional history of their comic book universe had gotten too complicated and contradictory. So they basically hit the reset button. The idea was that this would help them create a more streamlined, sensible history, as well as letting them try out new stories and origins for their character and, just bring some consistency to the comic book universe of DC. Now, with Aquaman, they had an additional challenge because over the years, a number of Atlantean-based supporting characters had sprung up. There was Aquagirl, there was Mira, whole bunch of people. So they also needed to hammer out a working history of Atlantis as a civilization and culture, but there were extra complications, and that's actually Superman's fault, or Superboy. See, in the 60s, a minor supporting character named Lori Lamaris, because at this point in time, the initials LL ruled Clark Kent's life, and he could not escape, was introduced. And Lori was a mermaid. A mermaid that Clark met in college. She attended college posing as a girl in a wheelchair, so she was using that classic blanket over her legs to cover her fish bits. And she and Clark started dating and had a whole college romance until they found out each other's secrets. And when they sat down and came clean, they realized that their romantic relationship had no long-term future, but they stayed on good terms even after breaking up. Now, why this becomes a problem for Aquaman is Lori claimed to be from the city of Tritonis in the lost realm of Atlantis. The problem is that none of the supporting Aquaman characters were mermaids, and as far as I can tell, the Aquaman comics never mentioned the city of Tritonus. Now, to be fair, even after months of searching, I can't find anything linking mermaids to Atlantis before this comic, actually. So, it's not until the late 20th century that someone makes the obvious jump of mermaids, Atlantis, mermaids in Atlantis. I'm not prepared to die on this hill because I've only been looking at this at a couple of months, but DC Comics might be the first major media to put mermaids in Atlantis, and that blows my mind. You think this is a kind of obvious connection, but as far as I can tell, this just never happened before. The solution they came up with was a simple one. Just make Atlantis bigger. So they turned Atlantis into a civilization of several undersea cities, with Tritonus being one of them. And Tritonus is a city inhabited by mermaids, of course. This also helped spark the current DC Atlantis, which you'll see in such shows as Young Justice, which is full of a wide variety of citizens, let's say, which has its own interesting effects on the story. So I feel like this was a great move and an overall improvement on the setting. This helped them hammer out a history of Atlantis and a solution to a number of their problems. And they decided to share this with the reading public, publishing the Atlantean Chronicles in 1990, with Peter David as the writer and Esteban Maroto as the artist. Before I get into that, I do just want to make a note that I personally enjoyed the art style in this comic quite a bit. I don't think this style is everyone's cup of tea, but I found it kind of fun to look at and a good compliment to the story, and it was kind of... I'm not a professional art critic, and I don't have a background in arts, so the best way I can describe it is the art felt lavish, but in a very nice, stylized way. I'm not an artist, though, so maybe I'm just completely off base here, but I'm going to tell you to take a look at this for yourself. The Atlantean Chronicles is mostly a history of the Atlantean royal family, and it's told through a series of chroniclers who are writing this down, but are also themselves characters in the story. And this makes a neat framing device for the whole graphic novel. What's also interesting is DC Comics shows us what the chroniclers are experiencing and what they're writing, and how sometimes these two things don't quite mesh, if you will. And it's a good example of how history is shaped by the biases and agendas of the people writing it. So you always have to look for ways to back up your primary source, and you also have to find ways to figure out what the biases and agendas of the writers of your primary sources are. Oh, and to define my terms here, a primary source in history is something written or recorded by a person as they're experiencing it. The diary of a soldier in World War II would be a primary source. The writings of the sage of the royal family of Atlantis would be a primary source. So this is great. I love it. They managed to hide a little educational lesson in this story. I'm okay with that. Now, the majority of this series focuses on the first two generations of the royal family, in a sense. The generation that ruled during the fall of Atlantis to Under the Sea, and the generation right after. And for the first bit, it's two brothers. We have King Oren, for whom Aquaman was named for. Well, his Atlantean name is Oren. Arthur is his land name, if you'll pardon the term. and King Orem's brother Shakalo, a priest and sorcerer who resents his brother's popularity and his devotion to science and technology. Now, Atlantis is already a high-tech technological civilization at this point, but they are constantly being raided by their neighbors, many of whom haven't quite hit the Bronze Age yet. So I kind of feel like the only reason this is happening is King Orem is not maybe being as proactive in his foreign policy as he should be. In fact, it's kind of interesting because King Orem's response to this is, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to build a giant dome over the city so no one can get in and raid us anymore. And I'm sitting here like, that is actually a very interesting construction, but wouldn't it make more sense to just get involved with your neighbors and make sure people who raid you don't get into power? But maybe that's too imperialistic, you tell me. Well, Shakalo does not approve of a dome because he claims this will infuriate the sky goddess by cutting her off from the Atlanteans. And honestly, the story seems to prove him right because after the dome is constructed, a meteor in the shape of a grinning death head falls from the sky and destroys the whole continent. That said, thanks to King Orem's dome, the city survives and ends up at the bottom of the ocean intact with everyone in the city alive. So I'm going to put this in Orem's win column, honestly. Survival, however, does come at a cost because while they survived, they watched everyone outside the dome die, and now they're at the bottom of the ocean. They can't even see the sun or the sky anymore. And as far as they know, this meteorite might have destroyed all of humanity. They might be the very last people alive on Earth. And this trauma and this realization, as well as the fact that they are trapped in this dome, they can't leave because they're at the bottom of the ocean. And this causes a lot of people to start slowly going mad. Because, think about it, you can't see the sky, you can't see the sun. You look out of this dome and all you see is endless water that will kill you, and it's full of creatures that you can really only conceptualize as monsters. Shakalo isn't really helping by telling everyone that this is all King Orem's fault, and if he had never built the dome, none of this would have happened in the first place. So you have this increase in violence and crime, as well as riots and civil unrest from people who decide they believe Shakalo, and people who believe that King Orem saved everyone by building this dome. And King Orem is really only able to keep this city together by the tips of his fingers and overwhelming armed force. This comes to a head when Shakalo announces he's leading his followers through a series of underground tunnels that connects this city, which is the capital city of Atlantis, Pondicidus, a little bit of a Clark callback there, to the abandoned city of Tritonus. Once there, he creates his own dome through sorcery. You see, he kind of lost faith in the sky goddess, and he's turned to worshiping a group of supernatural entities that are only identified in the story as the dark gods. And there's not a lot explained about them, except they seem to be willing to give magical power, but only in exchange for blood sacrifices. To give an example, when he creates this dome using his sorcerer's powers, he fuels it by murdering his wife, which is yikes. I think whatever else we can say about the dark gods, they are clearly not good supernatural entities, and dealing with them is probably dangerous. Certainly was for Shakalo's wife. This doesn't entirely relieve the mental, emotional, or social pressure, though, because people in both cities are still trapped in a hostile environment surrounded by creatures they don't understand and fear, and dealing with the trauma of having witnessed mass death, like on a world ending scale, and having nothing to do but think about it. To address this problem, or at least some of it, King Orm turns around and, after a long trial, I do like that in the story that it's shown that this isn't like just some wonder drug that King Orm whips out in an afternoon. He has to run trials on air-breathing animals that are in the city in order to make sure this works. He has to do studies to make sure that, your eyes aren't going to explode when we shoot you with the serum, but he does create a serum that allows the Atlanteans to not only breathe underwater, but resist the pressure and cold of the depths. And when he releases it to the people of Pondicidus, this actually creates a lot of joy and relieves a lot of the tension and pressure, because now people have things to do. They can go out of the city to find resources. They can explore. They can come to grips with this environment and distract themselves from what they've witnessed. The people of Tritonus, however, are still trapped, and King Orm decides, even though they have rejected me and they have fled to another city, they are still my people, and I am going to bring them the serum so that they don't have to live like caged animals. Shakalo is having none of this, and he flat out tells his people, do not take this serum. The gods will punish you. This is more of King Orm's wicked, wicked science. Where have we heard this before, right? And the people of Tritonus decide, no, we're going to take this serum, but mainly because they watched King Orm walk across the seafloor up to their dome, knock on it, and say, hey guys, you mind if I come in? So, powerful argument there, right? Shokalo takes this as a personal rejection, and he retaliates by turning to the dark gods and cursing the people of Tritonus to mutate after taking the serum. So the first generation, they all get frog legs, and their children are born as mermaids, but that comes later. Now, Shakalo tries to blame King Orm. He's like, look, he did this to you on purpose. But Shakalo's own son, probably bitter about having his mother sacrificed to dark gods, rats him out and goes, no, I saw my dad cast a dark spell to malignant gods to curse you people. And the people do not take this well. They flip out, form a giant mob, hunt Shakalo in the streets like an animal, tear him apart, and then murder every member of his family he can find, minus King Orm, who is trapped outside of the dome in the ocean watching this in horror. Shakalo's son escapes by hiding beneath the palace, and in his guilt and his rage, he decides that this is all Orm's fault. That it's his uncle's fault that his father died, not his fault for telling the people, or the people's fault for understandably exploding into rage at being cursed. But this sets the stage for a generational conflict between these two branches of the same family. It doesn't just set the stage for that, it also sets the stage for social tension between the people of the two towns, because the people of Pondicidus see the people of Tritonus as religious fanatics and now mutant freaks, and the people of Tritonus see the people of Pondicidus as a bunch of, stuck-up nerds. They resent the fact that they're looked down upon, even though, especially as further generations go and they turn more into mermaids, they feel they're the people best adapted for the underwater environment they actually live in. And the people of Pondicitis have no right to look down upon them because they're still holding themselves apart from the sea. Now, this is a limited series run. It was only about 7 issues, so there's a lot of skipped generations, and some events are left rather mysterious. But there's enough shown to give us a sense of how Atlantis grows, how they grapple with these problems, some of the solutions they find, because there are people on both sides going, hey, we really cannot afford this kind of racism, and we are all Atlanteans together. We need to learn to work and live together as one people. And the fact that there is this tension and give and take is one of the things I really like, because it makes Atlantean society feel very human, even if a good chunk of Atlantean society has the bottom half of a fish instead of a set of legs. Another thing I really like about this story is because it's a generational story, it gives us a good example of how generations adapt to their new environment and how they change their reference points over time. A good example of this is how Atlanteans view and refer to the passage of time. Oren's generation uses things like morning, afternoon, sunset, nightfall. These terms are meaningless to their children born after the sinking. They can't see the sky. None of them have even seen the sun. By the time their grandkids show up, birds are mythical creatures. I love that, by the way. Birds have become a myth in Atlantis. So their measurements and terms for time shift to the point that they don't talk about day and night. They talk about different tides. One thing I don't like as much is this reoccurring anti-science movement, and Shukalo showing back up as a demigod in the Atlantean pantheon, because this dude cursed an entire city. Why does he have a church, right? I can't be the only one thinking this. If you know what I'm talking about, sound off in the comments. What's your opinion? Now, that said, the reoccurring science movement does help explain some things, because in the last issue, covering Aquaman's parents, King Travis and Queen Atlantia, the king has problems siring children, and Atlantis has no solution. And I find this bizarre because this is a civilization that had ray guns in the Bronze Age. You guys had lasers. You have submarines capable of traveling thousands of miles without stopping. You have the ability to create a serum that turns people into water-breathing super Captain Americas that are strong enough to resist the pressure and the cold of the bottom of the ocean, and you can't solve something like male infertility, or maybe it's the other problem. Maybe King Travis's little monarch isn't able to stand up and be counted, if you will. I'm sorry, I'm 12. But Queen Atlantia is desperate to give him a son, not only to shore up his own flagging popularity among the populace, but to continue the monarchy. And when she has a dream of a demigod named Atlan promising her such a child if she gives herself over willingly, she's able to do that happily, and the result is our hero. Now, for reasons in the story, when he's born, everyone sees him as a cursed child and abandons him out into the wild, and things kind of proceed from there. To go further into that would be some spoilers, and I'm going to encourage you to read this graphic novel instead. It's interesting, let me put it that way. So you might be asking, how does the Atlantean Chronicles tie into the greater body of Atlantean work? What kind of influences can we see here? There is a callback to Plato's story with a modified version of Solon learning about Atlantis' first attempt to conquer the surface, which kind of causes the Bronze Age collapse. So literal sea people here. But the influence of Plato does not lie heavily here. It's more of a nodding reference. This Atlantis owes more to Donnelly, Smith, and Casey, in my view. Donnelly, because Pondicidus and Atlantis are presented as the first great human civilization and the wellspring of most human civilization and religion. Smith, because the very name Pondicidus comes from his work, and of course Casey, because he was the one who came up with the idea of the Atlanteans having ray guns in the Bronze Age, of all things. Atlantis is presented as this place with dark science and magic being side by side, which is an influence by Smith and, of course, Helena Blavatsky. The fact that the city is surrounded by these barbarian states ranging from Stone Age to Bronze Age, I feel is very much a reference to Howard's Atlantis. You remember we talked about how coal comes from an Atlantis in barbarism. But Atlantis itself is full of advanced technology like lasers, domes that can hold back an ocean, serums that turn you into a Superman. Although there are no airships, and I have to admit, I'm aggrieved to note that there is one thing lacking from Plato's version that I really like. There are no elephants in this Atlantis, and that bothers me. But I'm not going to complain about that too much in this video. Instead, let me end here by saying I hope you found this video informative or at least entertaining. If so, please leave a like, comment, or even subscribe. All those really help me in my eternal struggle against the dread Lord algorithm. Terror be on his name. If you'd like to support this channel, consider joining the ranks of my ever-wise patrons. Doing so gets you access to extra content and a vote on polls of upcoming content. And you can get all that for as little as $1 a month. Speaking of which, special thanks to Big Steve, who remains my biggest supporter, both metaphorically and literally. Thank you as always, man. Next week, we're going to tackle the Aquaman movie, and I hope you join me there. Until then, let me just say, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and of course, keep reading.